Well, Daniel, it's very nice to meet you. It's really an honor to be sitting here with you. And I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about your experience, particularly Vietnam and the relevancy to Afghanistan.
Well, I had the experience of watching the escalation of the war in the Pentagon, 1964-65, when I was an assistant to the Assistant Secretary. So I was able to see that from the beginning we were being lied into a war, which wasn't entirely new to me in the thought of government lies. I'd been a consultant for several years before that, and I'd seen a lot of lies, although not in real time, as I did on the night of the Tonkin Gulf episode, when everything the President said and my boss, Secretary McNamara, said was false about an unequivocal attack, unprovoked attack in international waters and so forth, and that we sought no wider war, when I knew that everybody I was working with was working night and day to prepare a wider war immediately after the election. But it didn't occur to me at that time that I had any duty to inform the Congress on that, even though it was clearly, in retrospect, clearly flaunting my oath of office, which, like yours, was not to the President.
Yeah.
It was to defend and support the Constitution of the United States. And in fact, I could ask you, even early on here, did that oath ever come into your mind as you looked at what your duties were demanding of you?
I never thought specifically about.
I didn't.
I never thought specifically about that, and I probably haven't until right now. But no, that definitely the idea of an obligation of doing what the right thing was, regardless of my own personal feelings or personal experiences up to that point, but the realization that this is not the right thing to be doing. This is wrong. We are committing troops to combat for no good or great purpose or no benefit to the United States. And so I felt there was I had an obligation to support the truth in this.
And that's an obligation to the truth and to the troops and to society.
And that's where it was an obligation. That's where most of it, and like in my resignation letter, I talk about that at the end, an obligation I feel, not just to the troops, but to their families. These families that are giving up sons, husbands, wives, daughters, fathers, mothers. If they're giving them up, they should be giving it up for a cause that's just or necessary. And it wasn't, and so I could no longer support that.
Did you have in your mind, as I did as a Marine, and we'll come back to that background, I thought of myself as a just warrior. I knew the doctrines of just war. I knew the criteria, the immunity of non-combatants above all, the idea that you didn't torture, you didn't kill prisoners, but in particular you didn't kill civilians, and that you had to have a just cause. That was quite a bit in my mind. Was that true of you?
Yeah, I mean, civilian casualties are an aspect of war. We've never had a more disciplined and professional military force. And they do. We go to great lengths to avoid civilian casualties. However, that's the nature of warfare. And that's a debate we need to have in this country. If we're going to enter into a war, if we're going to commit our troops to combat, civilians are going to get killed because that's the nature of war. There's no other way to explain it other than that. So the civilian casualty aspect was not an overriding concern to me. It's terrible, it's horrible. You know, I've been to war 3 times. There's nothing good about it. There's absolutely nothing good about it. But the justness of it, or the righteousness of it, or the benefit of it. If you look at a cost-benefit ratio for Afghanistan, what are we getting by asking these young men and women to die? And what are we getting for these hundreds of billions of dollars we're spending? It doesn't make the U.S. safer, and it doesn't, make us a more prosperous or a better nation. And then by the fact that we continue in a war that really there's no purpose behind or is not benefiting us, it makes us morally less of a nation. We lose that aspect of righteousness that we once had.
Why do you think it is happening then? Why do we have not only what's happening now, but why the prospect, the strong prospect of greatly increasing the scale of the war on the recommendations of our top military?
Yeah.
With, as you and you were the one who was there, I from a relevant background, can see is virtually a hopeless cause, that it's not going to make us safer in the long run, even any more than in the short run.
Yeah, it doesn't defeat Al-Qaeda, and it doesn't, and if that's our goal, when that's the right goal we should have, is to defeat Al-Qaeda. We can't, the way our economy is now and the way the world economy is, we could not sustain another 9/11 attack without having a terrible, terrible impact on financial and economic markets.
Why do you think then the top military are recommending this?
You know, McChrystal's assessment was an answer to a question posed back late last winter in the springtime of how do you stabilize the Afghan government and how do you defeat the Taliban, which should not be our goals there. So I think what the president's doing right now is the president is basically and rightfully doing a thorough policy review in Afghanistan. What are our goals? And once you get the goals, then how do you reach those goals? But McChrystal's assessment was an answer to one particular question: how do you stabilize the Afghan government? And that's what he came back with. I need these amount of troops, we need this amount of money, and we're going to require this amount of time, and then this will prop up the Karzai regime. But that goes back to another point, though, about the righteousness or the justice of our being there. Do we really want our young men dying to support a corrupt and illegitimate kleptocracy like the Karzai regime? You know, we didn't defeat the Soviet Union by propping up dictatorships around the world. We didn't defeat the Soviet Union by propping up Marcos for 30, 40 years. We defeated the Soviet Union because of the benefits of our system, and the Soviet Union collapsed because of all the negative aspects of its system. It wasn't a market economy. It was a system that repressed liberty, repressed free thought, repressed any type of development of its people. And that's why the Soviet Union fell. It fell because its ideals weren't right. We can defeat this jihadist, Islamist, extremist terror threat based not on combat troops, but based on ideas. And we don't get that if we just occupy Muslim nations. All we do is add credence to their argument.
As I understand it, you're in favor of just withdrawing from the combat operations in Afghanistan totally and right now. Is that right?
I would suspend or stop. And of course, you can't wave a magic wand and everyone disappear. You'd have to do so responsibly. You couldn't just tell everyone to pack up and drive out in the morning. That's not how these things work. But that would be my recommendation, is stop combat operations where we are fighting people only because, or they're fighting us only because we're occupying their villages or villages, or because we're supporting a central government that they don't want.
Well, isn't that everywhere perhaps outside Kabul?
I wouldn't say everywhere outside Kabul, but I would say everywhere outside of
some cities.
Yeah, some of the major cities, the cities in the north, particularly the Pashtun belt, that part of southern and eastern Afghanistan, and particularly among the rural population, the traditional, the religious, the poor. Within urban areas, we tend to have more support, but that's also the support where the Afghan Communist Party had, and the Soviet Union had their support from, among the secular, the progressive, the modern, the educated. And that's where I see this rift or the civil war in Afghanistan.
That's almost a mirror image negative, in a way, of Vietnam, because, of course, the communist-led liberation movement, the resistance to the occupation there, was almost entirely in the countryside. Yep. They had very little support in the cities.
Yeah. You know, when the communists came to socialists came to power in the mid-'70s, and when the communists took power in the late '70s, they both instituted a lot of reforms that were resented by the people, and that's why the people rebelled against the communist government. And that's after a year or two of outright civil war, a very bloody civil war. That's what led the Soviet Union to invade, was to stabilize that country. But these reforms that they instituted were somewhat severe. I've read that there were actually, interestingly, that there actually were some mandates put out by the communist government that men had to shave their beards, which is interesting because then 15 years later.
Like Turkey.
Like in Turkey, exactly. And that's what it was. It was very much that we're going to bring Afghanistan into the modern world. And so they did that by land reform, they did that by education reform, they did that by societal reform, and particularly among women, trying to advance women's rights. And that was resented and rebelled against by the Afghan people in the countryside. I had an Afghan general tell me he was very pleased that his province was the second province to revolt against the government in '77 or '78. He was from Badakhshan province. And he said the reason why was because the reason why people in the villages started to fight the government was because the government came to our villages and they asked us what our wives' names were. It was this intrusion into their lives that they resented. And it's still, and that's the base cause, or the rift that is the Afghan civil war. And it's the rift that still exists there. It's the reason why the people in the countryside are not just fighting us because we're foreign occupiers, but are fighting us because we're propping up the central government, which is the opposing side to them in the civil war.
Which, by the way, you often described as a very corrupt government, which it obviously is, but at the same time, incongruously somewhat, it represents, you see, the more modern progressive that relates to Western ideals and Western culture.
It does. It does. I could tell you the governor I worked with quite a bit was a professor before all this. He was a professor in Kabul and professor in Peshawar, and he speaks all the time about his daughters and his granddaughters, and he does want a better life for them. The question that you get into a larger aspect, though, or a question we should be having as a country is, do we want to commit our troops to combat to try and change somebody's society or culture? And I don't think that's in any interest of the United States to do something like that, to wage a war to change one country's culture or society. That's of no benefit to us, and it's counterproductive, because all it does is fuel the insurgency and increase the resentment towards us and to the central government there.
Well, you're describing our motives at their best, putting aside pipelines or oil or whatever. You're describing our progressive, modernizing motives, very similar to those of the Soviets in 1979 and later, which weren't successful, of course. And that raises a very large question. Here we had this experience before this, fighting pretty much the same people the Soviets were fighting in the same area and same place, with the same ignorance of their culture and the same ignorance of their language. And ignoring that experience, as far as I'm aware. In fact, let's get into that a little bit. Let me ask you to start with, when you went out there, were you encouraged to, or did you study the Soviet experience at all before you went?
I did. And that's
you did, but let me ask, I know you did. Did your colleagues do that? Were you encouraged
No,
to do it?
and when I recommend books to people, I tend to recommend books about Afghanistan that were written pre-September 11th, 2001. Because everything now with Afghanistan is colored by September 11, 2001. But how about
specifically the Soviet experience? What's your impression of how much the Pentagon has studied the Soviet experience, or the State Department?
I don't think not nearly as much. Not nearly as much that it should. I think when I bring up the Soviet Union's experience there, the automatic knee-jerk reaction I get from a lot of people, which is an irrational and emotional argument, is we're not the Soviets. True, we're not, and I'm not comparing our troops to the Soviet troops. The Soviets waged a brutal, horrible war, and our troops are the most disciplined and professional the world's ever known. I'm not comparing that tactical level. I'm talking about the strategic level.
Would they have been more successful, do you think, if they had been less brutal? Would the Soviets have been more successful?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. And the other thing that people, when you research into this...
So it's a difference that doesn't make the difference.
And when you research into, or you read about the Soviets' occupation there, they changed strategy 2 or 3 times. They changed generals out.
They experimented.
And I would encourage anyone who's watching this video to go to George Washington University's archives online and look up, they've got a wonderful collection of documents from the Soviet Union, particularly senior level deliberations among members of senior military and in the Politburo, discussing what are we going to do in Afghanistan. We've got to get out. This is destroying our country. And the arguments, you could literally take some of these documents, and I like to say you do put it in Microsoft Word, do find and replace, change ruble to dollar, change Najibullah to Karzai, change revolution with a capital R to democracy. And if you did that, that document would be intact. And it reads as well in 2009 as it would have in 87 or 88. You know, the other part about the Soviet Union's experience, too, is people forget that, or people don't know that the Soviet Union had up to 20,000 civilian advisors in Afghanistan. They tried this aspect of development. They tried to make Afghanistan a better or nicer place by doing aid work and by building schools and clinics. And all it did was build resentment among the rural countryside people.
Let me tell you something from my own experience. I was in Russia for the first time, not actually the second time, in 1986. So they showed me some brochures they'd made, which were in English for worldwide distribution, showing what a fine, progressive, modernizing, people-friendly, people-centric, all right, program that they had there about schools and literacy, which, by the way, as you pointed out, was their problem to a considerable extent. They really were doing that, which was evoking a great deal of resentment.
Yeah.
But as I read those books, I thought, this is what I read in Saigon, or what we put out in Saigon the whole time. It was the same kind of program, same kind of stuff. Here's this wonderful stuff we're doing. And I could foresee that it would end much the same way. I will say that when they went in 89, no, I keep getting the dates wrong, 79.
Yeah,
many people in this country, I can tell you, thought right away, now they're going to show the world how this is done, at least in a brutal way.
Yeah.
Yes, they're going to be brutal, but they're going to get the job done because they're not saddled with a youth movement. They're not saddled with academics. They're not saddled with an independent legislature or courts or media that are going to give them a hard time. So freed from that, they won't have one hand tied behind their back. They'll do it. And I thought, I don't think so. And I was knowing nothing about Afghanistan except that it was a country that for thousands of years had practiced guerrilla warfare very effectively, that had shown a millennial, and certainly the last century in particular, willingness to suffer great casualties in resisting foreign occupation. The merest glance showed you that they had the terrain for it, wonderful terrain for guerrilla warfare, and they had open border to friendly sanctuaries, in effect. So they had everything they needed for an endless guerrilla war that could not be suppressed.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that I don't hear talked about as much here in the States is certainly we talk about.
Which is still true, by the way. All those factors still apply.
And one of the key points that I don't really hear talked about much here in the States that we talked about a lot in Afghanistan is the culture of the Pashtun people, their code of Pashtun Wali, which at the end of it, if you look at it, really is, it's a code about personal sovereignty, that every man is his own sovereign. That's really what Pashtun Wali comes down to. There are different aspects of Pashtun Wali in terms of requirements to protect guests and requirements for revenge and requirements for forgiveness. There are several aspects of it. But at the end of it, really what it comes down to is that every Pashtun man is his own sovereign and will not bow down to anyone else. And that's how that culture is. So to think that you're going to come in and either with an internal Afghan government composed of urban Pashtuns or Tajiks and Uzbeks, or foreign occupation, that you're going to somehow have these people recognize you and recognize you as their sovereign is insane. It just goes against everything, all about how those people live and how they live for generations and how they would continue to live.
Yeah, I'm learning from you as I hear about this, and I have read some other things, such as they don't rely on a centralized justice system, particularly. But a big difference from Vietnam, actually, one that does not favor our efforts. Is that in Vietnam with the Confucian culture, but they also had an emperor. They had a centralized government. They were used to the idea of a centralized national government, which is a great difference from Afghanistan.
Yeah, for many of the rural Pashtun people, they see no difference in any of the central governments, whether it was the communists, whether it was the Rabini government, whether it was the Taliban government or the Karzai government. It's a central government that is not representative of them and has only benefited itself. You mentioned the justice system, and there's a very well-done, informal justice system that occurs at the village and valley level that's well-respected, well-understood, and is fair, and is equitable, and the people respect it and trust it. The central government's justice system there has never done anything besides benefit itself. So why would you take part in a justice system that, for like at least the last 30, 35 years and into the King's time, only serve to protect the interests of the government and not to protect the people, when you have an informal justice system that you respect, you understand, and that's fair right within your village and valley? Why would you give that up?
Well, okay, going back to what we were saying earlier a moment ago, the analogy with Vietnam. Here are some analogies. First, I saw the situation. I saw the Soviets are not going to have an easy, they're not going to succeed in this any more than we were able to in Vietnam. But another point is, I could have foreseen, but will we learn from the Soviet experience? Well, we know today the answer to that. No. But there was an earlier, I could have foreseen that, I didn't particularly.
You know, we hear recently now you hear this talk that we're going to do, we're just going to occupy 10 cities or so, or we're going to protect 10 cities, we're going to have this very urban, population-centric approach. That's what the Soviets did. And I saw it so clearly when I was leaving Afghanistan. I was flying up from the province I was in the south, in Zabul, up to Kabul, about 2-hour helicopter flight. And you just fly up the Highway 1, which is the only highway, the main highway there, and you just fly along it. And all you do is you see, outside of every urban area, you see a large American or NATO base. And I can guarantee you they're pretty much the same places where the Soviets had their garrisons. And that was ineffective. And the other thing about the helicopter, this just struck me, and I've got a photo of it I'll share with some people. But so the U.S. Embassy has a fleet of helicopters it uses. And the one I was flying in that day was a Russian helicopter, an Mi-6, but had been painted red, white, and blue. And it struck me as, you know, at the end of the day, you can paint it red, white, and blue, but it's still a Russian helicopter. And at the end of the day, an occupation is still an occupation, regardless of whether it's us, it's the Russians, it's the British, or it's the Tajiks and Uzbeks, the Northern Alliance. You know, I mean, a lot of people would argue that the Afghan National Army is really just the successor to the army of the Northern Alliance, and that's now occupying, has conquered, and is now occupying the south of Afghanistan. But I'm really enjoying hearing your comments on what you thought about the Soviets going into Afghanistan based on your experience with Vietnam.
Well, and let me add, okay, a couple. What you were just saying about the forts now tells me something else. If you want a long history, on the other hand, I'm learning in Afghanistan it goes back to resisting Alexander effectively and Genghis Khan. Those are tough tests, actually.
You can go and you can see in the 13th or 14th centuries or earlier than that, it's resistance to invaders, and the Muslim conquest stopped in that part of Afghanistan. The Muslim conquest in the I want to say in the 9th or 10th century only got as far as Zabulistan, as they called it then, and it was stopped. So it really has this.
In short, it's unpromising terrain for occupation.
You couldn't imagine better terrain for somebody to risk.
Or population.
And that's a key point. A lot of times when people talk about our troops being attacked, we fail to realize that we see it as an offensive operation against our troops. In reality, the people who are attacking us are seeing it as a defensive operation against our troops, which is a key point to understand.
Well, let me mention, okay, some more analogies here that strike me. I remember one day I was on a ride with an interpreter from Da Nang Marine Base in inland. And we went by, it was like an archaeological trip in a way, because we went by some popular forces, little forts that had been constructed more or less during our time. And then we came to concrete round pillboxes that were different construction, much more permanent, except that they weren't. They were Japanese pillboxes. And I should say that along the road down, the guy would also point out, now those were French forts along this road, all the occupiers who had been expelled. And finally we came to a large mound. We went by a large mound of earth. It looked a little unnatural, but it was covered with grass. We said, that was a Chinese fort. And as we went along, it was like, you know, going down one level after another to the archaeological sites. And I asked the lieutenant, a Vietnamese lieutenant who was going there, some kids asked for candy as we went along. And they were all saying, hey, American, GI, #1, hi, you know, all this. So hoping that we would throw candy at them, as happening, I guess, in Afghanistan now. And the lieutenant mentioned, when I was a kid, I used to yell to foreign troops also. And I said, oh, really? What did you say? Thinking he would say, bonjour.
Yeah.
He said, Ohio, which is Japanese.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And for me, as an American, see, I was 10 at Pearl Harbor, so growing up during the Second World War, it really, the proverbial chill on the back of your neck, the thought that I was walking in the feet of Japanese occupiers was a very chilling thought. But then I told this story to a friend of mine, Tran Ngoc Chau, who was in charge of the pacification program for Vietnam at one point. And he said, you know, you have to understand, we are a people who think of ourselves as having defeated the Chinese, although it took us 1,000 years. And again, I thought, uh-oh.
Yeah. there are some really severe cultural differences between not just Americans, the West and the Pashtun people. That reminds me, there's all these you know, idioms and phrases, and one of them is about how a Pashtun took his revenge after 100 years, and he was criticized for being too hasty. You know, their ideas of just their understanding of time,
time
and their patience.
The notion of time and patience here was
different than ours.
Chilling. And when Ho Chi Minh and Pham Van Dong used to say, we're prepared to fight 20, 50, 100 years, whatever, and Americans would often say, is he serious? Yeah. And people who knew the culture said, actually, yes.
Yeah. It is. It's true. When I would speak with the provincial leaders, the Afghan government provincial leaders in my province, in Zabul province, you'd ask them, how long should American forces or NATO forces stay in Afghanistan?
Who asked them?
I would ask them, or my military counterpart would ask. And the response we would get back, and this would be the governor and the deputy governor and the provincial council chairman and some tribal leaders and the leaders there, whether they're tribal leaders or actual Afghan government leaders. And they would come back and they'd say, well, you need to stay here for 20, 25, 30 years. And you'd say, why so long? And he'd say, well, only 10% of the people support the Afghan government here. That's why you have to stay so long.
And we're the Afghan government.
But
support us.
Yeah, but exactly.
It's going to take a while to win them to our side.
Exactly. So it's just their understanding of time and their understanding of patience. It's just so different than America's or the West.
Maybe we're getting some of our military, might say, are getting a little orientalized in a sense, because we're hearing from some of the military, they say 5 years, but you know they don't mean that. But some of them are really saying 10 years and 20 years. Yeah. And, you know, I didn't grow up hearing programs like that, you know, our 10-year program in some other country.
Yeah.
Exactly. But, of course, that, too, is a euphemism. Now, when McCain said during the election on Iraq, oh, if we stay 50 years, 100 years, referring, of course, to our occupation in Germany, sure, Japan, Korea, and so forth. You say, well, of course, that's not combat. Except when you look in Iraq, or which we haven't been talking about, or Afghanistan, you say, and are they going to accept us there after 50 years? Are they going to stop shooting at us, some people? No, it's going to be combat. Yeah. And the new Chief of Staff of the Army in Britain got himself in trouble by saying recently that it would be 40 or 50 years in Afghanistan, and that worried the government. He had to backtrack on that. I didn't say that, did I, or did I mean that? But he did mean that, and that's what we are talking about in these terms, except that they will still be there at 40, 50 years, and they'll still be fighting as the ones who are fighting as well.
In some parts of Afghanistan, and the danger with Afghanistan is talking about Afghanistan as a whole, as an actual country, in a sense that it's one single piece. It's not. It's so segmented. It's so disparate that you have to really, if you ever see a poll about Afghanistan, you have to dig down into the numbers. You have to drill down into that polling data and pull it apart from the different regions, and then you'll see how disparate it is. Because there are parts of Afghanistan that welcome our presence, that want an American or a NATO presence for a long time. But then
isn't this largely in the cities? In the
cities and in the north part of the country.
The Tajik.
The Tajik and Uzbeks, as well as in the cities where you have what I feel is the urban and Pashtun element that you know, fights against the rural Pashtun element. So you have part of the country that does support us, but that's not where the fighting's going on. And the fighting's and unfortunately, too, what we do so poorly, both military and civilian, is we only talk to people who want to talk to us. And then we take the idea that, well, since these Afghans came to us and spoke to us and said they wanted a central government, we take that as everyone wants it, when that's not the case.
Let me make that more specific.
Yeah.
Let me make a guess from my experience that the people we especially listen to are the people who speak English.
Exactly.
And I wonder how many of them used to speak Russian.
Oh, I can tell you that for the province I was in, the leadership, the police, the intelligence, and the army commanders in the province I was in were all Soviet trained. They had all spent time in Moscow, as you know, because they backed that side of that war.
So that they worked for foreigners and they fought for foreigners.
They did, and it's interesting too. Because when I was leaving the embassy, when I was leaving Afghanistan,
like us.
I had a conversation with a senior embassy official there, and basically, her comments were, listen, I meet with young Afghans all the time, and they want a central government. They want a better Afghanistan. And I believe that's true. There are a lot of people who want that, but that's only half the country. And my thoughts were, you know what? If you were to go back 20, 25 years, I guarantee you that someone visited from Moscow and they trotted out 100 bright young communists who were going to lead Afghanistan into a better age, into a better... And it was true, there were people who believed in that, and there are people who are fighting against it. And that's the same way as right now. And unfortunately, we only talk to people who tell us the things we want to hear, or who come into our embassy or our military headquarters looking for assistance to back them in their side of the Civil War. And we're not talking to the people. We're not getting out to the villages. We're not getting to those valleys. We're not talking to the people who are fighting us. And so we don't understand them. And our own arrogance makes us continues to push us down this path of that we will win them over.